Jesus and the Gospels, the podcast series with Father Denis McBride. This episode was recorded in front of a live audience at Hawkstone Hall, the International Pastoral Centre. Episode 7, The Beginnings of Discipleship in Mark and Luke.
In the last couple of lectures, dear friends, we were looking at the relationship between Jesus and those who have life in his name as one of the important characteristics of the gospel. And we said that in the Gospels, the evangelist tells stories of interaction between what Jesus does and says and between what others do and say. And that the people who have life in his name begin to make claims about him. It's as if the evangelists are telling us in a way that the best commentaries on Jesus are not books, but people. That the community that follow Jesus is the liveliest commentary about him. And that's why they're going to introduce us to a series of characters in the gospel who are going to point to him. It's as if they're all saying, given what happened to me in my life, who would you say that he is? What name would you actually give him? And we ended by saying, dear friends, the most obvious example of identity and direction and outlook in that experience is the story of discipleship in the gospel. And in these two reflections today, I'd like to look at the beginnings of discipleship in the Gospels. All four Gospels, notice, dear friends, they tell us not only a story about Jesus, but alongside that, they tell us the story of discipleship, don't they? You don't get Jesus alone. They don't tell the story of Jesus alone. They put beside that story the struggle, the fortunes, the failings of Jesus' own community. And those two stories are very closely intertwined in the narrative of the gospel. It's not easy to try to understand how discipleship began. And that's what I want to look at this morning. There are three totally separate traditions, even within the Gospels themselves, which depict different stories of how discipleship began. If you have your New Testament, which I'm sure you have, if you open it, dear friends, at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, Mark tells a story very quickly in his Gospel of the call of discipleship. Remember, dear friends, he begins with an adult Jesus who leaves home, goes down to see John the Baptist, listens to his preaching, is touched by the witness of John, and submits himself to the baptism of John. Notice when Jesus begins in verse 14, Mark says, after John had been arrested, Jesus went into Galilee. You've got a clear impression there of Mark waiting to tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth after John is off the scene. One of the ways you can watch the evangelist being nervous is in the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. Because in a funny thing, the Gospels of the public ministry open with John the Baptist as the spiritual leader, the great charismatic character, isn't he? That pulls people out into the wilderness. They're not going out into the wilderness to see Jesus. They're going out into the wilderness to see John. They're not confessing their sins to Jesus. They're confessing their sins to John. John is the great charismatic prophetic figure that dominates the beginning of the gospel. And he's so strong that the evangelists are a bit nervous about putting these two men together. Because if you see John, the great wild man, attracting people from Judea and Jerusalem, and then you see Jesus, who's not even started yet, who would you say is the more powerful character? See, they have to be careful. They're telling the story of Jesus principally, not the story of John. So Mark waits until John is off the scene. John is arrested. And when John is arrested, Mark says to Jesus, now come on the stage, because he's off it. And he goes up into Galilee and he starts preaching. Now, immediately in verse 16, what happens? He's walking by the Sea of Galilee and he sees two brothers, Simon and Andrew, casting a net in the lake, they're fishermen. And he says to them, follow me. Now, this is not an invitation. It's an imperative, isn't it? It's a command. It's in the imperative. Follow me. And the first thing he offers them, notice, dear friends, is this. They are fishermen. And he offers them a new identity. I don't know what this means. When Jesus says to the Simon and Andrew, and he says, I will make you fishers of people. I don't know what that means. Particularly when you think of what fishermen do to fish. I'm still not sure what that image means. It's an image, obviously, that tries to connect cleverly with what they're already doing, namely fishing, into another image that has something to do clearly with pastoral ministry. So what do? They drop their nets and they follow him. And then he goes a little further and he sees two other brothers, James and John, and they're in their boat and they're mending nets too, they're fishermen. He calls them at once. And notice the little development here. They leave not just their nets. What do they leave? They leave their father. In other words, it involves not just a matter of leaving what you're doing, it means leaving family and relocating your family somewhere else. They leave their father Zebedee with the men he employed, and they went after him. Now, dear friends, that sounds to me a bit strange. Jesus hasn't met them yet. They don't know who he is. They're from Galilee, down by the lake, Capernaum, Bethsaida. He comes from the hill country up in Nazareth. It doesn't make much sense to me, that story. A couple of years ago, I was doing a retreat for a group of lay people in Bristol on discipleship in the gospel. And I was looking at this passage, and I said, if you were shopping in Tesco's or Sainsbury's or wherever, and you were wheeling your fishing net around the aisles, filling it with whatever, and a man came up and tapped you on the shoulder and said, come, my dear, follow me. I mean, what would you do? There was a woman who was sitting in the front row, had been divorced for 2 years, and she said, oh, I would go. She said, it's the best offer I've had since I got divorced. Which kind of ruined the point of the story, but anyway. See, clearly Mark's not interested in giving a psychological reason for why the disciples followed Jesus. Remember, Mark started with an adult Jesus, and he wants to get the story moving. He's got this compulsion to get this story underway, moving on. So what does he do? He presents Jesus right at the beginning of his public ministry as a man who speaks with authority and who commands immediate respect. When he speaks, something happens. Dear friends, when most of us speak, nothing much happens. We decorate the air with language, hoping frantically something might happen. So Mark's very clear in portraying Jesus as a charismatic man, in the popular sense of charismatic, namely somebody who has a capacity to appeal to other people, someone who's attractive. Why else would you leave your family? Why else would you leave the security of your own job? Why would you go and attach yourself to a stranger? So I'm a bit puzzled by Mark's account. Psychologically, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me. In Mark's gospel, the disciples are portrayed as fairly chronically dull. They seem perpetually slow. They don't seem to get Jesus' jokes. They don't seem to get what he's doing. One of the interesting things to do is to compare two passages which tell the same story. If you turn over to Mark chapter 6, okay? Just turn over a few pages to Mark chapter 6. And at the end of chapter 6, you notice you've got the great miracle of the loaves, okay? Where Jesus feeds the 5,000, okay? Then after that, the disciples cross the lake again in a boat, okay? And Jesus stays to say goodbye to the crowd. Very charming. And after he says goodbye, he goes into the hills by himself to pray. Okay. He's alone on the land. The boat is out on the sea. And he can see that they're worn out with rowing. Okay. It's the fourth watch of the night. And he comes towards them walking on the lake. When they see him, they think it's a ghost. And they're terrified. And he identifies himself by saying, "Courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Now, watch what happens when he gets into the boat. Look at the portrait of disciples. They were utterly and completely dumbfounded. It's not a portrait of a real electric, intelligent community, this. And then in case you don't get what Mark is saying, he explains they hadn't seen what the miracles of the loaves meant. Their minds were closed. They just seem dumb. Now, that's the story in Mark. Turn to Matthew 14 to see how he tells the same story of the disciples. It's Matthew 14. It's the same story that Matthew takes over from Mark, but watch how he changes. You've got the miracle of the loaves again, and then you've got the story of Jesus walking on the water. Okay? The disciples say it's a ghost, same thing. Peter starts to move. He gets out of the boat, he walks towards Jesus, but he takes fright, starts to sink. "Save me," he cries. Jesus puts out his hand and holds him. Man of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, watch what happens when the wind drops in this story. The men in the boat bowed down before him and said, truly, you are the Son of God. In Mark, they're totally dumbfounded and thick. By the time Matthew comes to write that story, he turns a negative story into a very positive one. And he has a community of worshipping disciples who recognize Jesus as the Son of God. One of the reasons Matthew's Gospel was very popular in the tradition of the church. Before the 3-year lectionary, dear friends, very few Catholics knew Mark, because Mark was very rarely, if ever, used in our liturgy. Matthew was used the most, the great teaching gospel. And of course, one of the reasons Matthew was used a lot, because the disciples come out looking good in Matthew's gospel. Ray Brown told a story of when he was preaching very early on when the lectionary was brought out. And he was preaching in a church on New York on Peter's testimony of faith, where Peter says, you know, you're the Messiah. And after the Mass, a woman came up and she said to Ray, she says, Father, you didn't mention the other bit. He says, what other bit? She said, you know the nice bit where Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church. And Ray said, but it's not in Mark. In Mark, Jesus has a big fight with his disciples. Peter misunderstands totally what he means, so that in Mark's gospel, what does Jesus call Peter? He calls him Satan. Peter's the only character Jesus ever calls Satan, because he's so thick. When Matthew tells a story, not only is Peter not thick, he's way ahead of everybody. You know, and if you were a bishop, which gospel would you read? So, you know, in Matthew's gospel, the disciples come out looking much better. Some scholars have gone so far as to say that Mark doesn't seem to like the disciples, kind of particularly in the way that he portrays them as just permanently dull characters. And in Mark's gospel, it's interesting, the first person to get Jesus' name right is not a disciple. It's a Roman centurion at the foot of the cross. It's not Peter. It's an outsider, a Roman centurion, who says, remember, truly you are the Son of God. And of course, if Mark is writing his gospel in Rome, for Roman Christians, it's quite clever, isn't it, to have the hero from the local community. So the Roman community can say, excuse me, it was one of us. We were the ones who got it right. It's there in the gospel. So you've got, it's kind of interesting, Matthew, I haven't put Matthew's gospel down for the story of the beginnings of this discipleship, because Matthew simply takes over Mark's story and doesn't change it at all, okay? Now, watch Luke. Luke's tradition is quite different and much, much more dramatic. If you turn over to Luke 5, Luke's going to tell you the story of the call of the first disciples. Luke has Jesus begin his ministry, remember, by going to Nazareth, okay? And he goes home. He's just been down with John the Baptist, spent time down there, and then Jesus comes up to try out his new identity as the prophet. Remember, When Jesus left Nazareth, how did people know him? He was the carpenter, or the son of a carpenter, who was the son of Joseph, the son of Mary. He goes away for a while, and then he comes back again. And then he gets up in the synagogue. You know, I mean, think about it. Car mechanic in the pulpit. Well, why not? He gets up in the synagogue and he starts to speak. And when he speaks, they're fascinated by what he says. But what do? They move away from what he says to what? To his identity. And they say, who is this guy? We lived with this guy all our life. Who does he think he is? In other words, they don't buy his new identity as the prophet. What happened to you when you went home after your profession? I remember very well, I was in Perth, in Scotland, and we had to wear Roman collars and black suits, and you were 18 years old. And this was a Roman collar of serious proportions. You know, you could hardly bow your head, it was so big. And I was 18, and I got a day to go home. And the next day we were coming down here to spend 6 years studying. And I went home, and when I got in the house, my two sisters said, well, let's go out. And they said, for God's sake, we're not going out with you dressed like that. We were and put on something normal. You know, they weren't going to walk down the street with this daft-looking boy priest shining in his brand new identity. And Luke begins the story of Jesus' ministry with that story of total rejection. Nazareth says no. And Jesus has to end up running away and escaping. Now, Jesus is from the hills of Lower Galilee. Okay? Jesus is a Highlander. He's from the north. And in a lot of countries, people from the north are not awfully attractive to people from the south. Dear friends, in many countries, there's a geography of snobbery. Sometimes it's north and south. Sometimes, like Australia, where the big cities tend to be on the coast. It's a coastland interior. She's from the interior. Or east and west, whatever. I mean, it's like people from London who probably believe that the further north you go from London, the simpler people become. And of course, if you come from Scotland like me, you're totally simple. And you see that, you kind of see that in the Gospels, the snobbery of geography. When the Galileans come down south to the great smart city of Jerusalem in the south, people can tell them a mile off by the way they speak. The northerners, the country people, the yokels, the tuchters, as we say in Scotland, have come to town. And that's what Jesus is. He's a northerner. And not only from the north, he's from the hill country in the north. He moves to a totally different place, a place called Capernaum, which is on the borders of a lake. The famous Sea of Galilee or Lake of Galilee. And you've got the River Jordan coming in from Mount Hermon and going out from the south down about 75 miles down to the Dead Sea. And you've got the fishing villages, mostly up in the north, Bethsaida, Capernaum, and Magdala, Gennesareth, and Tiberias. Jesus moves because he has to move. He's expelled from his own town. And notice, dear friends, he never goes back again in the gospel. He never returns to Nazareth. He has to relocate himself. What happens to you if your own people and your own family don't buy you? You either change back, don't you, to what you used to do and please them, or else you go. What do you believe? Do you believe the voice of your family and the voice of the relatives? Or do you believe the voice that's telling you that you have become someone differently and that identity that you have is going to take you in a new direction? Jesus goes with his new identity as the prophet. And he goes down to Capernaum. And when he goes to Capernaum, notice, on verse 31 there, chapter 4, Luke says, gosh, his teaching makes a deep impression on them because he speaks with authority. Of course, they don't know him. They're not involved in his history. They didn't live with him. They don't know his family. That's the old definition of an expert, isn't it? A person from a different village. Someone from somewhere else. It's very difficult to be an expert with your own crowd. The people who know you well. Mark, in his gospel, puts that very dramatically when Jesus says a prophet is not accepted in his own country, among his own people, or in his own house. I've yet to hear a sermon on that one. The prophet is not accepted in his own house. And you say, who's in Jesus' house? He moves to Capernaum. The people like him. He's doing very well. He teaches in their synagogue. He doesn't get thrown out of the synagogue at Capernaum. They like him. Why? Because you can take the sick to him and he heals them. And then Luke slips in the fact that Peter and Jesus know one another. Now, he hasn't called them yet. Jesus is probably staying in the house of Simon, the fisherman. He's at home there. When he leaves the synagogue, he goes there. And he fixes up the first pope's mother-in-law, you notice. I know that's a bit of an anachronism, but an Irish priest told me recently that that's the reason why Peter later denied him. It's the worst mother-in-law joke I've heard. But watch what Luke's doing. Unlike Mark, he's saying these two are not strangers. They live in the same town, probably in the same house. The people, notice, bring all these poor folks to him. They bring the sick and Jesus heals them, okay? And they're so fond of Jesus in Capernaum. It's very interesting this. In Nazareth, Jesus is utterly rejected. And in Capernaum, notice, they want to keep him. They offer him a job, in fact. They offer him the job as the town chaplain. They want to keep him. Now, dear friends, if you've been rejected by your own people, then you go to a group of strangers and they love you, and they say, oh, stay here with us, we'll look after you, and you can look after us too. It's quite a seductive offer, isn't it? Especially after you've been rejected. What does Jesus do? He says no thanks. And he leaves Capernaum and he travels way down south to Judea, and he hasn't called anyone. Is that making sense? He's at home in Capernaum. Luke says he's living with his people. They know him, but he hasn't called anybody. And he goes south, alone. And then at the beginning of chapter 5, one day he comes back up to Capernaum from down south Judea. And when he comes back up to Capernaum, the people are so delighted to see him, they nearly drown him by pushing him into the water. So what does he do? He has to borrow Simon's boat, notice, and pull out a little from the shore. It's a lovely image, isn't it? They're so delighted to see him, they press him almost into the sea. Whose boat? Simon's, because Simon's a friend. And after his little homily to the people, he then turns to Simon and he says to him, "Put out into deep water." Okay? Out into deep water, into the middle of the lake. Now, dear friends, this is very strange advice to give a man who is an expert fisherman in Galilee. It's very strange advice. Why? The reason why the principal fishing villages are up here is because up here are where the hot springs are. Even Tiberias has hot springs. And the hot springs, especially in the winter, attract the fish. Dear friends, anyone who's been to the Holy Land, you can stand in Capernaum or Tabca or Tiberias. You can stand and you can look into the water, and what do you see? You see the fish there. They're coming to you. At the time of Peter, most of the fishermen would simply have gone around in their boats around the north shore of the Sea of Galilee to fish. They didn't have to go out into the deep. If they went out into the deep, they'd be bypassing the fish going in. Plus the fact, of course, the River Jordan was bringing in nice goodies on the menu, as rivers do, coming in. So it looks a bit strange. Put out into the deep. The psychological imagery is fairly clear, isn't it? Why don't you go where you never go? Out into the deep. Why don't you fish in the deep and stop hugging the familiar shores? Now, he's not talking to a stranger, is he? He's talking to this Simon knows him well. And Simon says, "Master, we worked hard all night and we've caught nothing." Okay? We could all say that about our ministry, can't we? Not even a sardine. Dear friends, if you're a fisherman, you prove you're a fisherman by catching fish. Simon's a bit vulnerable at the moment. He's not got anything to prove that he's a fisherman. He's got no fish. And then he says, "But if you say so." In other words, he's already been exposed to the authority of the word of Jesus. Do you see what I mean? Jesus is not a stranger. Simon already knows when this man speaks, something happens, so do it, even though it's against your own instinct. What does Jesus know about fishing? He's a Highlander. But Simon has already been exposed to the authority of the word. So what does he do? He gets into the boat and he goes out into the deep. And when he puts down his net and tries to pull it in, Again, the imagery is fairly clear. Simon cannot handle by himself what comes out of the deep. Which of us can, dear friends? Most of us need help to handle what comes out of the deep. So he calls for help from the community, right? When he goes back shore, you would think he would offer Jesus a job as his manager or something. He's got a nose for where the fish are. Instead, he does something very Catholic. He turns to Jesus and he says simply, "Leave me alone. Just leave me alone." And he gives the reason why Jesus should leave him alone. Why? Because he's got a governing identity of himself as a sinner. It's not a bad speech for a first pope. I am a sinner. The first 3 words of St. Patrick's autobiography, ego patricius peccator. I, Patrick, a sinner. Simon, notice, is a very dramatic story. Simon wants to disconnect from Jesus because he's a sinner. He doesn't want to follow Jesus. He doesn't want to stay in Jesus' company. He wants distance between himself and Jesus of Nazareth. And then Jesus wants the opposite, doesn't he? Jesus is looking for Simon Peter to attach himself to him, even though he is a sinner. And Simon will not stop being a sinner, will he? When he's in the company of Jesus. What's Jesus' mission statement? I have come to seek out and to save lost people. Jesus is not embarrassed by people who are sinners. That's why the Pharisees have so much trouble with him, in a sense. Remember Psalm 5. In Psalm 5, there's that wonderful line, "You are no God who loves evil, and no sinner is your guest." There's the image of God who will never connect with sinners. And then you've got this Jesus who's going in the opposite direction, happily connecting with sinners. Now, remember his name. His name is Simon Bar Jonah, which is translated son of John. And of course, that's a surname. Son of John as a surname in English is in fact Johnson, isn't it? His name is Simon Johnson. He's a fisherman and he's a sinner. And it's this Simon Johnson that's called to follow Jesus and see himself in a new light. Jesus gives him a nickname, which is interesting. In Aramaic, it's Kepha, which we translate into Greek. Petros is Peter, isn't it, in Greek? And Petra is rock. It doesn't work in Greek, but it works in Aramaic. Now, My great professor, Raymond Brown, has written 2-volume magisterial commentary on John, and he's got a section on the translation of this. And he says, this Kephar is not a proper name. It's a what? It's a nickname. So what's the nickname from rock? Rocky. There we are, Rocky 1. It's a nickname. And they never say why he's given this particular nickname. In Aramaic and in English, funnily enough, it works beautifully. Why? Because Rocky in English means 2 totally different things, doesn't it? Rocky can mean firm, can't it? A rocky, solid, hard ground. Or it can mean like a rocking horse, very, very shaky. That's why it's clever. Because there are times when Peter will be like a rock, firm, reliable. There are other times when he's going to be very rocky indeed. When he'll end up in the infancy narrative, in the passion narrative, denying his own discipleship. Are you another of this man's disciples? No, I am not. That's presumably why it's clever. Nicknames often draw out, don't they, a characteristic of the person. And this characteristic of Simon is that he's a bit rocky. It's very clever. That's why the other 2 that get nicknames, remember, the sons of thunder. Because when they're opposed, they like creating thunderstorms and holocausts wherever they go, because they've got a ferocious temper. These 2. So that's quite a clever nickname. Beware of the sons of thunder. Now, I'm going to stop there, and in the next reflection, I'd like to move on to looking at the most original account of them all, of the call of discipleship in the Gospel of John. Good. Thanks. Now, do you have anybody got anything? We've got how are we doing? Is this making sense? So today, Mary.
Could it be also all 3 connection in the fact that Matthew was a disciple and an apostle, and Mark?
Scholars have a big problem. There are 661 verses in Mark's Gospel, okay? Matthew uses just over 603 or something, or 604 of them. I don't know of any scholar who believes that Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. Most scholars would believe that Matthew was a very clever scribe, possibly a rabbi, who actually became a disciple. Remember that sentence I quoted from you in Matthew's Gospel. Every scribe who becomes a disciple of the kingdom brings out of his treasure room what is old and new. If Matthew, there's never been any claim that Mark ever was a disciple of Jesus, okay? So scholars say, why would Matthew, if he was a disciple, why would he follow the shape of a gospel written by a man who was not? Why wouldn't he simply use his own experience, his own memory to write the gospel? Matthew's gospel is probably written roughly about 85, 95, 50, about 50 years after the death of Jesus. And when you read the gospel, it's clearly written in controversy with the Jewish synagogue. By that time, many of the Jewish Christians were thrown out of the synagogue. And Matthew, like John, is trying to find the spirituality for a people who are now out on your own. So, as I say, most scholars would believe that by and large, the Markan priority, that Matthew is following Mark, basically. But that obviously he's got his own sources. Not only that, they say that Matthew's got his own sources, which are called M, and then he's got another source called Kelly or Q, and that Q is shared with Luke. Namely, Luke uses that as well, so that Matthew is using, for his own sources, he's using Mark. He's got a unique source, and he's also got a source he shares with Luke. But most scholars, I will come to that when we come to the formation of the Gospels, most scholars today, about 85%, 90%, would argue that none of the evangelists were original followers of Jesus, that they're second generation, and that the stuff that they're getting is actually coming from the apostolic preachers. It's not immediate.
While listening to these recordings, you might want to have the book, Jesus and the Gospels, beside you. You can order your copy at www.rpbooks.co.uk or find the ebook for your smart device. Thank you for joining Redemptorist Publications on this journey with Jesus and the Gospels.